Hi, St. John. This is Lindsay here, and I am with Dante Stewart today.
Hey, what's up, y'all?
And he is going to share with us a little bit about racial healing. And Dante, first, just introduce yourself. Tell us who you are.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. I'm Dante Stewart. Everybody calls me Stu. I'm on staff at a local church, Tabernacle Baptist Church, a historic black church here in Augusta. I'm currently a student at Emory University at the Divinity School, doing work in black literature and black embodiment and theology, as well as I'm a writer. So I'm a writer. I write for a few publications, and husband and father and all things in between.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You're a busy person.
Yes.
So I appreciate your time with us.
Full life.
Yes.
Full life.
So why did you become a writer, and why did you join the ministry?
Yeah, I think for me, that writing story for me began in some sense out of anger and out of rage. For James Baldwin, who's an incredible writer, James Baldwin, he says, to be black and to be readily conscious in this society, and to honestly kind of be aware of this society is to always be in a state of rage. And so for me, writing in some sense gave my rage a way to speak. Rage is good, and I think rage, as Nehemiah found out, and many people in the Bible, can be, and even Moses, can be a tool for social justice. It can be a tool for catalytic change. I believe that even rage, a particular type of rage or whatnot, is in some sense grows out of a spiritual experience with God. And so for me, my black rage really made me put pen to paper, because it was the only way for me in some sense to wrestle with the things I was wrestling with, and to give voice to in some sense to the voices of my people that were crying out within me. Now, ministry is a longer story that I won't tell, but ministry for me was, in some sense, I love the church. So I'm a church boy growing up in Pentecostal church. I'm a church boy. It just is what it is. I felt that being in the church space, it would allow me to kind of utilize my gifts in the best way possible, as someone who cares deeply about black literature, but also who cares deeply about the church and theology. So
Yeah. So as we've seen over the past year and even beyond, we are in need of racial healing in our world. And so why is racial healing in particular so important to you?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because for me, in some sense, when I think about healing, I don't even know if that's even the framework, for society or even the church to take on for ourselves right now. I think the framework we need to kind of work through is, how do we tell the story of what has happened racially in this country? How do we narrate that story of race in America before we can even get to healing? Yes, healing is a part of it. But I think, in some sense, healing, to put the words racial and healing together is to take for granted, the reality that, sometimes some wounds won't heal, but you can live in the midst of such deep woundedness, especially when you're talking about in a society that still, in some sense, in very fundamentally ways, race has become it has been for centuries, a defining and destructive reality, particularly in the structure of our society, and policies and practices and principles, and even in the church, and how we think about the body, how we think about Jesus, how we think about the mission of the church, and what we take for granted. And so I think, racial healing for me, yes, is important, but I think racial reckoning, in some sense, is a more important word for me, particularly how do we tell this story? Because if we can tell this story in honest ways, then hopefully we will become better. And I believe healing, in some sense, is this kind of, ongoing process of dealing with trauma, trying in some sense to give trauma voice, but also create conditions to which those who are traumatized will not be re-traumatized continually, if that makes sense.
Right. So tell us the components. So we talk about racial reckoning and
Yeah.
what is kind of step by step, what is needed in order to achieve that? Or to walk that path even.
Yeah. I think in some sense, it depends on, your demographic. Now, for me as a black person, when we're talking about racial healing, it's for me, it's leaning into the complexity of black life, telling our stories not simply as resistance to whiteness or to white supremacy, and to, in some sense, try to create some real and enactable black power, and in some sense really embrace black beauty. And so, particularly for white people, I think in some sense, it's hard to say step by step because, life is not that way. Life is an ongoing process. And I think, I do believe that in some sense, if a first step is to be had, it is taking into account and asking yourself, what is whiteness and how has whiteness played into America and even into the church? You can't begin to move and to change unless you know who you are and where you're coming from. The church says, when we come before God, we come in humility. We come with certain attentiveness and awareness to our own personal limitations. And so that's why we have a certain dependency on God.
Right.
Because we understand that type of limitations by being human. And so I think when you're talking about race and America, particularly for white congregations or white Christians, it is asking yourself, what story do I come from? What is the story of my church that I'm at? What is the story of my family that I come from? And how have my family and the places that I come from taught me how to think about myself, how to think about my neighbors, how to think about the world, and how can I get a better picture of who I am before I, in some sense, begin to, move into, solidarity. Which I would say that's the next step. It's like narrative solidarity. How do you, narrate stories of belonging,
right,
or whatnot? How do you immerse yourself in another person's story, realizing that their story is as real as your own? The world is as real in somebody else's story as your own story that you generate meaning from. And so I think, taking into account those stories and retelling that story, but also we need some policy work. We don't need colorblind policies. Colorblind policies don't fix racist problems. And America just doesn't. America, we don't have a unity problem in America. We have a racism problem, and we have a white supremacy problem in America. Across our policies, across the various, fields of our society, even in theology and in the church and in what books in our curriculum. In some sense, we have to ask, who do we imagine to be someone worthy of love, worthy of cherishing, worthy of valuing? So for me, that is a meaningful part of what we mean by what I think, the beginnings of steps to be had.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us about a time that you might have seen healing take place through ministry or school or writing or anything like that.
Yeah, well, wow. That's I guess in my own personal life, as a writer, like I said, as a writer, words become ways to heal. Toni Morrison, who's a brilliant black writer, wrote amazing books. I believe everybody should read her books. She wrote this essay, No Time for Fear, no place for self-pity, no room for fear. And she said, we writers, when people are in despair, that's when we writers go to work. Because this is how civilizations heal.
Right.
It is healing, come from, the language that we take on ourselves, and the language that comes from the people. And so leaning into what type of language comes from the people, or what type of language comes from inside of us, or what type of language can we bring on in ourselves. The Christian faith is a faith of language. We have this message that has transcended time and space and people. And it is this message of good news that's not only upset civilizations and nations, but also in some sense had the balm to heal people. BALM, had the balm to heal our wounds, and had the kind of necessary framework to help us imagine better for ourselves. And so, I think in some sense, for my own personal healing, I think that's been the case. No, but I do think, in our society, particularly as I think about Black Lives Matter, in this past summer, the revolutionary summer, I think in some sense, if we are to think about healing, I would say that this summer was the beginnings of some type of reckoning and healing, particularly, Black Lives Matter and the movement is, as I would say, a movement of the Spirit of God to remember those bodies which are wounded and forgotten in society. And so we know as we read in our sacred text, that when the Spirit comes, people who are left out and marginalized have their voices heard. And now they are able to have their stories told. And so Black Lives Matter in the summer became the work of the Spirit by telling the story of George Floyd, by telling the story of Breonna Taylor, by telling the story of Ahmaud Arbery. And those people who were cast off and marginalized and separated through kind of segregated social and theological space were able to find themselves communing and congregating together in the streets, telling people that God has not forgotten you, nor have we as well. And so I would read Black Lives Matter and the kind of, in some sense, the remembrance and the repentance and the renewal, the theological renewal, the social renewal, the political renewal that we saw last year as the beginning of healing. And in some sense in our country, particularly, in Georgia and in this country, to say no to a certain type of politics that wants to bastardize Christianity and that wants to, use Christianity to protect a certain type of political and religious right ideology, to have people of faith and goodwill come together to say no, to have the emphatic no to that type of politics and religion. That is the beginning of healing. And so I think wherever people, in some sense, like the book of Acts would tell us, wherever people embrace their stories, embrace themselves, and want to see better and want to hold out better for the church and society, that is the beginning of God healing the nation, healing the church. And in some sense, that's kind of where I read kind of stories of healing in our society. Yeah.
It's good to have seen a glimpse of that hope, right? Through all this kind of hopelessness we've had. So our series throughout Lent is on the healing power of Jesus.
Oh yeah.
And so
one of my favorite topics to talk about.
Yes. And so how does your work in healing, in racial healing, connect with the healing power of Jesus?
Yeah. Well, that's good. That's good. I was reading actually not too long ago, M. Sean Copeland, who's a brilliant Black woman, Black theologian. She said in some sense, that the gospel does not just want to change our lives, it wants to transform them. And that, to declare that Black is beautiful is to declare a truth, a theological truth that has oftentimes been cast aside.
Yes.
And so for me, as a writer, my work is to tell Black stories. My work isn't about educating white people. It isn't about, in some sense, convincing white folk that we're human. That is far too limiting. Black life is so much more than resistance. Black life is beautiful. It has a stillness and a power about it. And so when I think about the healing of Jesus, and I narrate these stories of healing in the Bible, these stories of healing on the one level is spiritual, but on another level, the stories of healing are political and social and kind of in some sense existential. And so when Jesus heals people, he's not just performing a spiritual reality, but Jesus is kind of reinstituting dignity, power, and agency. Jesus is shaping dignity and destiny. And so Jesus is not only letting people know that your body, not just your reality and your story, but your body becomes the site of divine revelation, of the desire of God. And so when healing in the Bibles happen, we need to read it as this is something that God desires of bodies. Jesus wants to see bodies healed and whole again.
Right.
And so for me, my words, become, as I would imagine, that type of ongoing revelatory work of the desire of God for black bodies in society. That God wants our black bodies valued and cherished, beautiful, whole, and put back together again. And so that's kind of how I narrate the story of Jesus healing in my own life and work.
Okay. Well, thank you for everything, and thank you for your wisdom and your experience. And this has been Dante, Stewart, and Lindsay, and we are here to talk about the power of Jesus in healing. And today we are talking about racial healing.